Seconds.
15.
10.
And welcome everyone to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Poikinen. I am coming to you from finally not wildfire smoke encased Humboldt County. I am joined by my better than your co-host Glory Jones. What's happening, Jones? How you doing?
It's happening at Saban Theater in Beverly Hills at 6 p.m. because apparently George Bush is supposed to be speaking at an event. So Answer Coalition will be there, and I will be there. And hopefully I just need like a 200 meters vicinity from George Bush. Then I'll know he'll hear me. So.
Yeah. No, that megaphone is wonderful. Action for Assange does not skimp when it comes to voice projection equipment. God, I love that thing. I do. Before we introduce our guests, I want to welcome everyone who's listening to us on Aftermath FM, iHeartRadio, everywhere else we are streaming. The show is sponsored by Matrix Bars. Matrix Bars are a psilocybin mushroom chocolate bar. Boy, howdy, are they excellent and delicious. You can get a hold of them by, I gotta go pull up the QR code. I guess I should do that before I start this shit, huh? There we go. Are you on the screen? There you are. You were on the screen. Let's move you. So if you scan the QR code or DM them on Instagram and Twitter at Matrix Genetics, MATRIX GENETIX, the little white rabbit will show up and escort you down the rabbit hole. We are entirely viewer funded. We have GoFundMe that's circulating. The link for that is in the description. Otherwise, PayPal, Cash App, all that stuff at Slow News Day Show. You can also buy Sleepy Josh a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Bort, BORT. And I think that's it for the business whatnot. I am very pleased to be welcoming back to the show Dr. Piers Robinson. Where did that go? That's right, the co-director for the Organization of Propaganda Studies. Believe he founded the working group on Syria, propaganda, and media. And then the working group on propaganda and the 9/11 global war on terror. Dr. Piers Robinson, welcome back to the show. It is a pleasure to see you again.
You're muted, Doctor.
It wasn't me who muted, but anyway, thank you very much. It's good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back.
So, we do a call-in show every Friday, and we were talking after that about how none of us have ever seen or witnessed a moment in history this heavily, rapidly, and so thoroughly saturated in its propaganda. Is that an accurate assessment, or are we limited by just the fact that we're alive in this time and not a different time?
I think that's a reasonable assessment in my experience of my lifetime. And I think this is something which Professor Mark Crispin Miller, who's a little bit older than me, 20 years plus on me, has said that this seems to be the biggest sort of propaganda operation stroke event or propagandized event that he's ever seen, certainly that I've ever seen. So I think that's a reasonable assessment of what we're seeing with COVID-19, kind of global nature, but also the penetration of this in terms of something which is affecting so many people, and so on. So yeah, I think it's accurate. This is very big, and I think what we're living through at the moment is a very big, major point in human history.
I have oh, go ahead, Jones.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it's true. I mean, I don't know if there's been a point in history where there's been such an influx of various different propaganda mechanisms directed at sort of a similar purpose and a similar agenda. It's probably the most in my lifetime, but yeah.
I mean, so when I think about the billions of dollars spent just on influencer campaigns alone by getting people on YouTube and social media and Twitch, and then having them push forward and we're going to be really careful right now because we're on YouTube. There's some other stuff that I want to talk about before we cut the YouTube stream and have the majority of this conversation on Rockfin, which kind of speaks to not just the insane propaganda war we're in, but the over-the-top censorship that we're experiencing because of this as well. But when you look at the amount of money and I guess the microeconomy generated from just this propaganda campaign, like, how is the rest of, I don't, at least academia who works in the sphere of media, not seeing this?
Well, this is one of the lessons, I think, that can be taken from COVID-19 and that can be learned more fully than has been learned before, that academia is caught up in the trappings of propaganda and propaganda activities in a very profound way. And this is something which I've been sort of trying to argue for a number of years, in terms of people looking at propaganda and strategic communication and saying this is not just to do with the mass media. It's not just, as Herman and Chomsky sort of kind of imply with their propaganda model, you just got to look at the mainstream media and so on. That academia is caught up in this process. And actually, I mean, I made this argument back in 2003 with a colleague, Eric Herring, when we wrote about how the propaganda model as devised by Herman and Chomsky, it works for academia as well. All the filters that apply to the mainstream media can be applied to academia. And I think with COVID-19 and what we're seeing with the role of a lot of academics in terms of building the narrative, but also, as you kind of alluded to before, the censorship issue, the censoring of those academics who are not saying the right thing is just amazing. And in a way, we have if I was to look at this from a purely detached, objective academic point of view, rather than being someone, as we all are, caught up in the stream of history with this, what we have with COVID-19 is a perfect case study analysis for anyone who wants to start to really look into the way in which academia is caught within bigger power structures, and the way it becomes, a tool, a propaganda mechanism, a site upon which propaganda is generated. And this is a case study which is second to none, I think, in terms of helping to show that. And I sort of think a lot of people are learning this. People are looking at what's going on. They're looking at, particularly this censoring of scientists. And I don't mean the kind of censoring of, the sort of the social scientists and so on, or the political scientists. What you've got with COVID-19 is some pretty major epidemiologists, for example, people from the natural sciences. I'm trying to get away from what is a public perception, which is that you got the proper academics, the real scientists, and then you got all the social scientists over there and so on. Social scientists, and I've been experienced censorship and so on in relation to talking about Syria. But here with COVID-19, you've got these people such as, in the UK, Sunetra Gupta from Oxford being smeared and closed down. And it's, in a sense, becoming very, very obvious for a lot of people and a lot of the public that our academia is not functioning in the way that it should be. It's just so blatant. And this point about censorship you raised, it's getting very, very obvious for anybody who wants to open their eyes what's going on, and very, very obvious, the way in which our academia doesn't function in the way that it should be in the grand scheme.
I think that's one of the reasons why when I first had, I think that's one of the reasons why when I first heard the Mickey Matt acronym from Ray McGovern, which is the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia think tank complex. I think that's one of the reasons why when I first heard that acronym, it really stuck with me, because it included academia in sort of that, and really institutional education in general, in kind of this propaganda mechanism that aids the military industrial complex. Because one of the angles which we've seen how academia is all a part of this greater scheme is particularly when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to pushing CIA talking points in places like Syria, and really pushing out dissent or pushing it to the fringes when it comes to anything that's really challenging something like the CIA, or how we even think about Western foreign policy in general. I think from that angle, it was refreshing to see people recognize academia's role in it, and then also in rewriting history in general, which is also a central part of international relations. But like you said, the further we get into just everything going on with COVID-19, it really becomes more and more apparent how much dissent or any questioning of the official narrative is being pushed out of any corner of society, really, especially academia and institutionalized education.
Yeah.
Well, as you guys are talking, it's making me realize that academia is less a reinforcement mechanism for propaganda and more of the framework. Like, it's more of the part of the foundation for, because out of academia is where our future narrative managers come from. And maybe I'm being too harsh on academia here, but I'm not necessarily seeing that. And I would like to. I'm genuinely interested in what you think about that, Piers.
I think that's a good point. That you can sort of let some of academia off the hook, so to speak, by saying, well, they're reinforcing, they're just following in the contrails of these more powerful actors who are pushing agendas and so on, and academics are just sort of either staying quiet or just going where the money is. But I think in a very important sense, because academia is a place which people look to as a site of knowledge creation, and because people look to it as a site in which objective knowledge is created, it becomes very, very important, I think, in terms of helping to set the terms of debate in society on any given issue. And in a way, we'll come back to COVID-19, but certainly this issue of, say, international relations and international politics. I think that the way in which there's been this close proximity between a lot of international relations scholarship and political power has played an important role in terms of constructing public understanding of international politics and enabling the military-industrial complex, or imperialism, whatever you want to label it as. And it plays a really important active, not just reinforcing, a very active role in the creation of propaganda drives, in the creation of myths, for example. So yeah, I think I think it's important to understand that there isn't a sort of benign isn't the right way of putting it, but it's certainly not the case that academia or academics are getting it wrong because they're just following, as it were, following the drift or following agendas which are being presented. They're also, at certain times, at certain points, very important in terms of helping create those agendas. Not necessarily particularly knowingly. I mean, this is the point about applying the propaganda model to the mainstream media. You've got a whole number of factors which come in to shape the way academia operates. And there is, of course, funding streams and research council funding. Obviously, in the sciences, there's big industry funding research and so on. And that pulls academics towards agendas which reflect the agendas of powerful, influential and financially influential actors. And that shapes what academics do without them necessarily quite being fully aware of that, I think. But there's also the culture within academia, this kind of self-censorship you get. And this is what you see in the mainstream media of academics just being very, very nervous and timid about asking questions which are going to get them a lot of criticism. And you see this very clearly in terms of fighting shy of research on 9/11, for example. But you also seen it, of course, in terms of fighting shy on talking about Syria, is that academics, or Israel-Palestine, or any of these controversial issues. And academics, I think, are very timid about that, and as a general rule. And what all of that means is that something, an entity in our societies which is supposed to be a place for rigorous, open, challenging debate simply isn't that. There's a lot of money coming in directing academics to look at this, not that, and then there's an awful lot of timidity amongst academics not to ask challenging, difficult questions. And that really sort of closes off academia as functioning properly. And then within that, I think you do have more directed, that there is, as with the mainstream media, there's this question mark over academics who are sort of playing dual roles, for example, and so on. And I mean, I think it was the Church Commission in the US in the 70s identified a lot of intelligence operatives operating in the US media, right? And I'm not sure sort of if anyone's really sort of done the kind of studies in relation to academia, but I would think it's a reasonable hypothesis, and that's me being careful with my words, a reasonable hypothesis that you have a similar kind of dynamic within academia as well, with some academics who are playing dual roles.
It was through the church committee too that we found out that academia was the home of MK Ultra, and we know for a fact that on Ivy League campuses, on Jesuit-owned campuses, on campuses that have like Boston College, for example, that have these like open intelligence agents, they set up booths on campus. They're there for job fairs. The international relations program at Boston College is one of the most widely recognized open pools of CIA and intelligence agency job recruitment. I mean, it's not even remotely conspiratorial to talk about it because they brag about it. The whole concept of Dulles' and James Jesus Angleton's CIA was, we're getting the eggheads. We're getting the smartest people from the best schools so that we can have the most high caliber intelligence agency on the planet. And that's something they learned from the British secret, intelligence services.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there's that strand within academia who happily sign up to, as it were, working with the state. I mean, you have the same examples in the UK. I mean, I noticed that the British University recently just appointed Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat as some kind of associate professor of some kind.
Yeah.
But it was also a department.
Oh my god!
Oh, that makes me sad.
I think they'd also at the same time appointed a former MI6 chief of some kind as an honorary professor as well. So that, you know, they're clearly setting themselves up as, you know, we have the connection with power, and so if you want to be lined up for a job in the British intelligence services, this is the place to come and study, and so on. So there are some universities which are very open about that, and so on. The Elliot Higgins thing aside for a second, but I think the more in a way that those universities or those departments which do that, you know, at least they're kind of very open about it. Yeah, so people know, okay, so those guys closely associated to intelligence services or State Department or whatever. You know, the broader problem in academia is all of these departments where, you know, who aren't playing that game, as it were, of getting sort of into bed with you know, governments and states, but and who sort of, you know, say we're a critical department, we're properly independent, and of course they're not, for all the reasons, you know, we were talking about earlier, that their academics are constrained, they're timid, they're influenced by funding streams and so on for potential research grants. And so the departments which people might look to as that's going to be a critical department, you'll get the really critical questions being asked there. You don't, and that actually performs quite an important sort of demarcating the outer boundaries of dissent and debate and so on. That is, well, if that department isn't talking about, for example, the issue of 9/11, then it surely can't be a legitimate question and so on, because if it was, then at least that department would be asking that question or questions about it. And so I think, you know, it's in a way it's worse with the departments who don't sort of openly recruit former MI6 and openly, you know, proudly employ or appoint members of Bellingcat and so on, which is not an independent, neutral, in open source investigative journalist outfit by any stretch of the imagination.
Bellingcat is about as independent as I am a Liverpool fan. But yeah, I was gonna, and I will just add to that, like, to think, when I think of the critical questions that they'd be asking in those departments in academia, if they are any, they would be so centered around these hyper theoretical discussions that people would get, you know, completely not I don't want to say bogged down, because they would have their heads so far up in the clouds of like this discussion of like theoretical academic terms and concepts, and just really like hyper intellectual, hyper pseudo intellectual terminology, to the point where they're completely losing themselves in a theoretical discussion and lose the current world, the reality that we live in, you know, this very brutal reality we live in, where war crimes are being committed in the Middle East and Africa as we speak. So yeah,
that's an important point, and that's something which, you know, I think quite a few people over the years have observed, that there's this tendency to over theorize, to get exactly as you described, get bogged down into very detailed, very abstract theoretical arguments, which ultimately become, you know, it's a very inward-looking small community of academics going around conference circuits talking about particular theories or approaches, and really becoming quite disengaged from what's actually going on in the real world. I think there was an economist made this point about economics models which were being generated within the academy, and this came out of this kind of critique that you know, Marxism and Marxist analysis had been excluded from a lot of economics departments and courses and so on, and so that you just had neoliberal economics being taught or preached to students, and so on, and this wasn't a very healthy state of affairs. And I think one of the arguments associated with that was that a lot of these kind of economic models which are being produced had no did not resemble, or they did not concur with reality, and they weren't even being tested, I think, was this what was being suggested. And the point there was being made was that there's a lot of potential for an academic to get on in academia by creating very elegant, very interesting models and so on. And other academics go, wow, that's a fascinating idea, and look at the the intelligence in that, and so on, and you get promoted up. And the same could be said for very elaborate theories or constructs and so on. Academics love it, and it gets you promoted, and it gets you seen as a smart cookie and so on. But these things can be completely detached from reality. Or have very little resemblance to reality. And this has been one of the criticisms that's come from some quarters over the years with international relations scholarship, for example. There's the empirical side of it is lacking, and it tends to be over theorized. But I actually think the truth is a bit more nuanced than that. I think there's a tendency to sort of this separation between very empirical work, which isn't really theoretical, and so on, which becomes often very just problem-solving type research, and then very abstract theory, and a real failure to try and bring two together in a more consistent way. But all of those tendencies mean is that academia can end up being a very inward-looking ivory tower exercise, and very detached from reality. And I mean, this would be one of my points about international relations scholarship, and say the issue of 9/11, which is, we're going to talk about this before we go on to COVID. And actually some people have started to publish papers. There's a paper by David Hughes, I think, in Alternatives a year ago about the academy and 9/11. And there's also a paper in Globalizations by an Australian law professor last year talking about the issue of 9/11. And so at least you've got some people starting to bring it into some of the mainstream academic journals. But it's absolutely extraordinary, and this is when I started to look at some of the issues around 9/11, that you could not find in all of the scholarship in international relations a really sustained, objective analysis of issues surrounding 9/11 and the actors involved. And it's incredible because you look at that entire industry, the critical terrorism studies, the war on terror, all of this literature generated out of the war on terror by IR academics, but all assuming that the official narrative about 9/11 and about Al-Qaeda was accurate. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. And, I mean, the first thing you should be doing as an academic is saying, well, okay, you've got an event here. Let's get to the bottom of this event. And go from there. But most of IR academia, in my experience, simply assumed what George Bush, you're going to see soon, George Bush was saying from day one about responsibility and about what had happened, and then what the 9/11 Commission said, without any critical reflection whatsoever. And when you step back and look at it, you think, wow, how wrong can you be? How wrong can international relations scholarship be if they've missed a critical issue that 9/11 is not as we understand it in terms of the official narrative? Then what it actually means, when you think about it, it means that vast swathes of books and articles published over the last 20 years, just a waste of time. In terms
absolute
of objectivity and truth seeking, which is maybe one reason why many IR academics get really scared about thinking about 9/11, because it's like, oh blimey, I built my whole career on
security studies.
Yeah, security studies, which is assumed something which is untrue, and it's like, well, which road do I want to go down? How do I want to open that door? No, I'll just keep that one shut, and I'll keep walking down the road I have been. And I mean, it's as bad as that. It's potentially, if 9/11 is properly opened out into academic attention from the mainstream, which it is starting a little bit, there's going to be a lot of egg on a lot of faces, I think.
I've found that no matter what field it is, hyper specialization is almost the exact same thing as hyper compartmentalization. And you just build a wall around your specialty and you don't let anything else in. But when you leave that wall, because you have that specialization and all of the credentials that come with it, you, as the specialist, know everything about everything. And everyone else is an idiot because you are a special. And I'm not saying you, I'm just saying, like, this is something that I've experienced, and it definitely not unique to academia. This is a problem in general, where as people become hyper focused on something, they'll drown out everything else, and then the tendency to work your research backwards to support whatever your conclusion or your proclivity is becomes a major issue, especially when what your conclusion is dependent on whether or not you're going to continue to receive funding.
Yeah, I think that can be a problem, but it also, I think, can work the other way, right? So that academics, are pushed into this specialisms, and some people argue, well, this is a part of the natural progress of knowledge as you get ever greater specialization going on. But what that's sometimes used to do is that when academics become aware of an issue which is perhaps wider than their area of specialism, and they offer their assessment, they're immediately discredited. They're saying, well, you're operating outside of your expertise and so on. And so I think that can sort of work both ways. And I think it's useful for academics. And we all have areas which we research and so on. But it's also important for us to sort of try and look at a wider picture, and also think about how our area of specialism might bear upon that wider picture. So, I kind of, with COVID-19, have talked about how my research in propaganda helps to understand aspects of COVID-19 and so on. And to be able to do that without, for example, getting slammed by some mainstream journalist about, well, he's talking about things which he has no expertise in. He knows nothing about COVID-19, which is not true. And this is a criticism, of course, which the working group on Syria propaganda and media have had, in particular from people such as Oliver Cam from the Times, that we have no expertise in chemical weapons, so therefore we can't talk about Syria, OPCW, and chemical weapons. And of course, that's completely untrue, because we do have expertise on things like propaganda and international politics and so on, so we can illuminate aspects of that. And if we need expertise on aspects of chemical weapons and so on, we can consult people and so on. So this kind of interdisciplinarity, which we actually need, I think, if we are to get full understanding of issues. And this goes with COVID as well as 9/11, kind of interdisciplinarity that you need, and also allowing people to talk sort of outside of their immediate area of specialism, or bring their area of specialism to bear. Needs to be, I think, encouraged. And actually, when you think about the 9/11 issue, that's a really good example, because you have a certain community of scientists who have raised questions surrounding the building collapse and so on, and sort of technical material which someone who's a social scientist wouldn't necessarily have expertise in, but can understand if it's explained to them carefully and so on. But sort of drawing upon their expertise and bringing it into a sort of a more holistic analysis of what happened is very important. So you need scientists, you need engineers and architects, as it were, as you have with AE 9/11, and then at the same time, in the same way that sort of AE 9/11 they only briefly talk about what's the broader political context, but of course understanding the broader political context surrounding 9/11 and the regime change wars and US foreign policy is actually a critical part of helping understand the bigger picture. And so that I think we do have specialisms, and academics do have areas which they can they publish in and so on, but There also needs to be this kind of confidence towards interdisciplinarity, basically, and allowing different area specialists to talk to each other. And also, as I do, for example, if I was giving a kind of analysis of the issues surrounding 9/11, sort of one aspect of that would be to refer to the engineers and the scientists who have raised questions and so on. Say, well, this is part of understanding that the official narrative is problematic and so on. But I agree with what you said. I think what you described does happen, but I think it can also cut the other way, and people can get boxed into their area of specialism and are prevented from moving out of that. And I've actually heard this quite often in relation to Syria and the OPCW, where people who have expertise on, for example, bureaucratic politics, they simply won't talk about the OPCW issue, because they just say, well, yeah, but that's the science, that's the chemical weapons. I have no expertise on that, and I couldn't possibly comment on any of that. Even though you're not asking them to comment on, a chemical or asking them to comment on a particular weapon, you're just asking them to comment on what about the way in which the scientists and the investigation has been organized? Surely you could comment on that, but they sort of say, no, I can't. That's the chemical weapons, that's the science side of things. So academics use it as an excuse to avoid, often, I think, sort of probing the important questions.
20 years on from 9/11, it seems like that particular anniversary went by with more of a whisper than it should. There was and that's not for lack of trying. And there were a number of successful and very wonderful In the Damn Wars protests. Here, there one in central London, one in Germany, and a number of very good discussions, talks. But from where you're sitting with you, and I know we just had a whole thing on specialization, but based on your particular areas of expertise, what do you find are the most shockingly omitted provable realities surrounding 9/11 that ought to, and I know that we are finally 20 years later starting to see a little bit of movement towards reality on 9/11, but in terms of things that have been out in the open the entire time for the last 20 years that just have not been touched, that should have at least brought a little bit more closure to the victims' families and brought a little bit more recompense to the first responders who are still suffering multiple medical maladies for this.
Well, I would start this from the point of view of a researcher trying to look at this, and the first thing that I would say that's been, as it were, or the omission has been the failure on the part of academics to properly analyze and investigate the events of 9/11 and the actors involved, in terms of historians as well as political scientists and so on. That's been a huge omission. And so what that has allowed is that the official narrative is essentially allowed to stand. And that itself is illogical and essentially a major intellectual omission. This is extraordinary that you haven't got the kind of rigorous evaluation of various theories, hypotheses in relation to 9/11, and then a healthy, rigorous academic debate. It just didn't happen, and so on. And that's glaring, because what that means is that the official narrative on 9/11 rests on really nothing more than what we have been told by governments. That sort of flows pretty rapidly into the 9/11 Commission report, which I've read, which does not represent a rigorous, detailed analysis. Other people have looked at it and have identified all of the holes and omissions of things which simply don't make sense. I mean, of course, we know that Zelikow was the person who was in charge, and I think they even structured the content, as it were, before it had been written. And you had the 9/11 Commission. You had some of those commissioners saying that they were set up to fail, etc. So that's the fact that you have a 9/11 Commission report, and then you sit down and read it, and you're basically being told a story, which and you're having to rely upon, you're having to trust the American agencies and so on various issues. That's glaring over an issue such as 9/11, and it's amazing that it hasn't been subject to more academic scrutiny, and it's incredible that an event such as 9/11 hasn't had the kind of objective, legal-based investigation that it should have. Which, of course, is why we have all these calls now from the Lawyers Committee and so on for inquiries and so on into what happened. I mean, has anyone actually been put on trial yet? They're holding.
Well, if you look at people who have helped bring to light what happened in the wake of 9/11, I mean, we had Chelsea Manning tortured for a year and then sent to prison for a number of years. Julian Assange currently incarcerated. Daniel Hale, 43 months on whistleblowing on the drone program. John Kiriakou, 32 months. For disclosing the torture program. So, I mean, there have certainly been people that have been locked up as a result of the war on terror, just not in the direction that anyone would ever want in a sane society.
But I think the point I was getting, the key suspect in relation to alleged suspect in relation to 9/11 is being held in Guantanamo Bay still after 20 years, still awaiting trial. I mean, which is extraordinary. How can that be in any way considered to be justice or proper, rigorous legal approach to 9/11, where you have somebody who you're accusing of being a key plotter, and 20 years later he's still sitting there? I mean, I thought they were going to start the trial this year, and they might have done. I might be slightly behind on that. But you've got somebody sitting in Guantanamo Bay for 20 years waiting trial.
Well, and how many presidents ran on closing it? Since he's been incarcerated, since he was kidnapped and thrown in a freaking hole, how many presidents have ran on, we're going to shut down Gitmo? I mean, the idea that the United States can operate a kidnap and torture facility in Cuba just unimpeded is still one of the wildest things to me. Yeah. It really is. And I mean, more to that point and more to Guantanamo Bay and the fact that we just threw people in there and have let them rot for decades. This is the kind of crime against humanity that if another country was doing it, there would be U.S. aid going, there would be benefit concerts, the United States would be, ramping up tensions to go liberate these people and bring democracy to that nation. And it's only through a combination of unending, enduring propaganda and the ability of media and I guess really the entertainment complex is a reinforcement mechanism to push the reality of 9/11 into the memory hole and into just complete obscurity, making anyone with a rational argument or factual information on it a tinfoil hat wearing kook.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say your question about what are the glaring sort of omissions. I mean, the last one I had. I mean, there are so many with this. It's difficult to list them off the top of your head. But the other obvious thing is the issues that have been raised by the architects and engineers and AE 9/11, obviously over the years, that the collapse of the buildings in New York, and also in particular WTC 7, World Trade Center 7. I mean, again, I'm not going to move outside of my area of expertise, but there are some very convincing, detailed scientific analyses in relation to that, which raise absolutely profound questions about the event itself, and the fact that organizations such as NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, who did the investigation on WTC 7, were, according to AE 9/11, pretty fraudulent in how they did that. Quite aside from the fact that, as people always point out, you had a third building which wasn't hit by a plane, which then came down, very rapidly.
Because of office fires.
Because of office fires
from debris.
So you can understand why there's 3,500 architects and engineers who've signed up to the demands for a new inquiry, and you can see why. But I mean that all of that's glaring, and I think that's glaring that the scientific community, the engineering community, and others who have expertise haven't engaged that as a proper issue. And I know that there is some now, because of course Professor Halsey at Alaska Fairbanks did the study on WTC 7, and there's some degree of academic engagement with that at the moment, making slow progress, but at least it's going on. But it's absolutely incredible that whole community of architects, engineers, in the broader mainstream, don't look at what are incredible collapses. As far as one can tell, pretty much unexplained by the official reports. I think AE 9/11 were pretty clear, weren't they, about the two main towers, that the analysis proceeded up to the point to try to explain why the structure gave way, but then failed to offer any explanation of how the rest of the building was destroyed at such speed by just the failure at the top. And I think this is Niels Harrett's point that, from Newton's laws, it doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. There would have been resistance, and it wouldn't have come down. All of these kind of arguments, which we've seen again and again from the critical scientists, just not being responded to by the mainstream academics. And that does show, that's testimony to the amount of propaganda around 9/11 and the way in which questioning and reasonable questioning has just been made toxic. And of course, along with any other academic who's raised a question about 9/11, it's incredible how quickly you find yourself in a newspaper. Just even for asking, I mean, I know that the first time, I don't want to mention him again because he might get cross with me, but the first time Oliver Cam started to be nasty to me over Twitter, he's the Times columnist, was after I think I had tweeted something about the Professor Halsey study on WTC 7, the one at Alaska Fairbanks University. And I just tweeted it. But, there's this guy's looking at this study, and let's wait to see what he comes up with, about how this building came down. And immediately Oliver Cam was hounding me on Twitter. He actually ended up, and I've got a record of all the tweets. He's demanding to see my reading lists in my department at Sheffield University.
Really?
To say, well, are you pushing this stuff on your students as though I was some kind of drug dealer? And all I had done is I had tweeted a reference to the Halsey study at Alaska Fairbanks. And I think at the time I was saying to him over Twitter, well, take this up with Professor Halsey, not me. And it was incredible. So, but that shows you how closely policed 9/11 is. You open your mouth about it and you're being hit. And of course, before me, there was Steve Jones at Brigham Young in the US. He's the guy who identified the nanothermite traces in dust. He was pushed out. And every other academic who's opened their mouth about 9/11, you just get hit pretty quickly by the steam train of you're a conspiracy loon, you're a nutcase, and it's incredible. It's incredible.
First of all, that
There
would
were-
make class 10 times more interesting for students, because then we would at least have some varying thought and stimulating discussion. Like I've had professors that I vehemently disagree with, but because they at least like went against what popular academia was saying, it made the class more enjoyable and more stimulating. So like, that's even if you disagree with someone completely, not just like raising questions about something that's so obviously manufactured.
The University of Alaska Fairbanks study sought only to look at what the NIST report said and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what the NIST report said could not happen. They weren't making any theories about who was responsible for 9/11. They weren't making any claims as to what happened to Building 7. They were only looking at the NIST report and applying, physics to it. And Bill Hicks has a joke about the JFK assassination where he says, I know it looked at a layman or someone who might dabble in physics that a bullet shot from over there, and that's the thing. But I mean, it's the exact same thing. If you look at Professor Halsey's report study and what those grad students did, what they're able to come up with, you cannot, with even a basic understanding of how gravity works, of how buildings work, you cannot look at the NIST report and go, yeah, no, that makes sense. And NIST now is tasked with finding out on what happened on January 6th this year. NIST is going to be involved in that. They're part of the 1-6 commission. To give you any idea of how closely tied these narratives are. It's sunrise, sunset with this. And at this point, I think it's a good time to end the stream on the YouTube and continue the discussion over on Rockfin, where we are allowed to talk about whatever we want to. And will. So I'm going to drop the link.
Tell me when to kill it.
Okay, I'm going to drop the link in the YouTube chat. If you are watching on YouTube, why? And you do not need an account on Rockfin to watch the rest of this live stream. If you want to participate in the chat, you can sign up for a free account. If you really like what we do, you can endorse the channel. It's $9.99 a month, and you get everyone's paywalled content on the network. Thanks again to everyone who's hanging out over here on the YouTube, and we will see you